Hello, so this is going to be our final lecture for the course, and I'm going to try to cover a lot of things and do some review. So we're going to talk about evaluation, policy, content analysis, big data, and then I'm also going to try and incorporate some review of experimental and quasi-experimental designs, because a lot of you said that in the survey that you were sort of still confused about those. So it's going to be a longer lecture because I'm trying to cover so much content, but none of this is going to be graded on, and it's more for your own benefit. And you can watch at your leisure or not, whatever works for you. But I tried to incorporate your all's preferences based off of what you had submitted in the survey. Okay, so we are covering content analysis, existing data research, not so much comparative research, and then evaluation research. So evaluation and problem analysis are really important for the policy process, and especially in criminal justice research, we're often trying to implement reforms, and what's really important for whether or not reforms are successful is like how we evaluate them, and also how we analyze the problems, because policy is not always done in practice how it's written. So it's important to really analyze what the policy goals are in order to ensure that the particular outcomes and policy intervention that we're trying to do is actually successful. And there's been like a large increase in like within the foundation worlds, that's where I come from, and also within like the state and federal government to provide evaluations as a part of the services that you provide. So a lot of ways that this sort of gets structured is that there's a foundation funding something, or a government organization funding something, and then a nonprofit or social service provider is the one doing the intervention, and maybe there's an independent evaluator, or the nonprofit itself is doing the evaluation. And so there's a lot more room for evaluation and developing evidence-based policies for criminal justice in particular. So the policy process, like basic civics course, you're usually having some type of demand, and so this can come from like citizens or from an outside organization, and then policymakers try to develop some legislation or program or law that gets at the particular goals and that particular demand. So for example, like restricting solitary confinement, that was there's been legislation on that in New Jersey, and so there was particular policies that were put in place by the government that try to restrict that, right? And whether or not those policies are effective, it would be like the topic of evaluation research. And so what is actually produced is like the policy output. So depending on what your policy is, it's like the means to achieve the goal. So if I were like I know in solitary confinement in particular, a lot of governments will sort of put limitations on it and exceptions for solitary confinement, or means or limitations on how long someone can be put in solitary confinement. But whether or not that happens in practice, or whether or not that happens in general, is sort of the outputs. And the means by which. So the putting limitations on it and like tracking it would be the means by which you're trying to limit solitary confinement. And it's sort of ironic in the policy world. Oftentimes we'll find that the means that we're trying to do something actually perpetuate the thing that we're trying to limit. So sometimes tracking solitary confinement more can actually increase solitary confinement. Another example is like ban the box, which I've talked about before. So there was, particularly in New Jersey, there's a ban on the box for jobs that don't necessarily require, like, there's no reason that you having a criminal background will anyway affect your work. And so they banned the box, but a lot of employers instead will take race as a proxy for criminal history, which sort of perpetuates the problem. Ban the box initially was to try to increase access to jobs of people who have a criminal history, and that is disproportionately Black and brown folks. And so this policy that was implemented, which is more administrative, to ban the box, actually increased racial disparities in outcomes, right? And so it's really important to know the means and your goals, because a lot of times, like for instance, bail reform, a lot of people are trying to address bail reform and say that by implementing reforms in bail that will help racial disparities, but it's not necessarily a policy that addresses racial disparities themselves. It like claims to. So it's really important to remember what the specific goal is for the policy and whether or not the means sort of match up to that specific goal. And I think, particularly in criminal justice, we are very open to instituting reforms that are more administrative, but we really need to think about whether or not those administrative fixes are actually getting to the core of the problem and the issue. And oftentimes, policies that do get to that are more structural and like involve more complex answers than just administrative fixes. And so this is where quasi-experimental designs are really helpful, because the policy is seen as the independent variable that's having an impact on the dependent variable, which is the impacts what the policy seeks to achieve. So whether or not it creates its impact is the dependent variable, and the if some policy, then we expect some results. So if this thing, which is the independent variable, then we expect these impacts, which are the dependent variable. And so, like I said, learning the policy goals is the first step to doing evaluation research. So whatever the program is, what its intended goals are, really specifying those things, because a lot of times programs will have a lot of different literature on what they can or can't do, but really defining what, like, if it's restorative justice or if it's sort of these broader programs that have been applied in different contexts, like what is a specific goal in your specific context and how are you addressing that specific thing? And so there's differences between like program evaluation, which is more within the policy stage and defines whether or not policies are being, one, implemented as they were planned. So like I said, it could be written on the books, but it might not look like how it was intended on the books. And then whether or not it's gained that goal. So if it's having the desired impact, and whether or not the policies in practice look like what they are in the books is called process evaluation. And also like policy implementation. I came from a policy background in undergrad, and that's what the term that we use as well, policy implementation. Then there's also, like we said, the goals are the first step. And first you want to understand if the particular thing that you're looking at is even able to be evaluated, right? Because oftentimes researchers were interested in particular topics, but maybe we don't have the buy-in from stakeholders, or maybe the program's objectives are more abstract and we can't quantify really what their goals are. Or maybe we don't have the data to analyze whether or not those people meet their goals. And so these are the different aspects of that evaluation assessment. And you really need buy-in from particular organizations. You need to properly define what the goals are and how they are implemented or translated into program components, and what kinds of records or data are available to you. And really define who has a direct stake or indirect stake, because often there might be like some influence there to like program evaluations. Is really important to have an independent person doing it, because if you're doing it internally, there are sort of incentives to make sure that the policy looks like it's doing well, right? And like I sort of mentioned, different stakeholders have different goals and views in like how a program should operate. So a lot of times when you're trying to pass something, whether that be a policy intervention or a program, people have different perceptions of what the program should actually do. So sometimes it can feel a little bizarre because you're talking to people about the same thing, but they have very different perspectives of what is going on or how it should be happening. So it's really important to clearly define those particular goals and statements, and have them in like we sort of talked about operationalization and measurement, like have those in definitions that can be measured, because sometimes, especially in the policy world, we often talk in very jargony terms of like impact and risk and like assessment and all of these sort of terms that become sort of hollow. And so you need to make more specific definitions of those things, and also really understand, like I sort of mentioned, that like there's broad definitions of like restorative justice programs or anti-violence programs or racial bias training, but like what does that mean in your particular context given your different policy structure, and how might your thing be delivered differently? So I'll get into an example of this later in the lecture. And so quasi-experimental designs and experimental designs are the most ideal for evaluating things, because it allows you to filter out the selection bias that often occurs when you're developing programs, because programs are often geared towards a certain demographic, or people get filtered into programs in a particular way, like say people on house arrest, like they've gone through a specific court process, and we know that the criminal justice system has selection biases within it. So we need to sort of do a randomized experiment to say that the only independent variable that we have is the particular intervention or policy that we're looking at, and not a bunch of confounding factors like socioeconomic status, race, criminal justice involvement, all of these different things. We want to isolate it so that the only thing is the criminal justice intervention. And so you can go back to the quasi-experimental lecture to get more into that, but something that we need to take into consideration is like randomized experiments are often good if we can say that there's like a limited resource and like randomly assign people to a program or not a program. Or sometimes people will have a pilot program and some people are allowed in the pilot program, and then the other people can be allowed in later after the evaluation is done. So there's a way that there's a case flow of people coming into your program or not. And that's really important to understand because that creates selection. And then there's also treatment integrity, which is really hard to maintain in like programming intervention, because a lot of how treatment is done is through particular counselors, through particular things. So it's good to have like a very defined curriculum or a very defined some type of mechanism in there to ensure that the intervention is delivered to everyone in the same way, because it could be different based off of the counselor or the location of the program and whatnot. And there could also be changes in the program that happen, and so that can also undermine treatment integrity. So treatment integrity is just making sure that everyone gets the same type of treatment, which is really hard in the real world. Oftentimes, we can't really randomize in program interventions. We have to provide the program to everyone who's eligible, or else it's unfair, and there are sort of ethical concerns. So some ways that people get around this is to do quasi-experimental designs. And remember, the difference between experimental designs and quasi-experimental designs is that experimental designs have randomization in it. Like, before people get into it, they are randomized in whatever way that they are. But in quasi-experimental designs, we don't have that randomization component, so we create a pseudo way to randomize people. And so there's different types of ways in which we can do that. And so one way to do that is like if we identify people who are in the program, so this is in a full coverage program, so if everyone's applied, and then we identify people who are similar to the people who are in the program but are not exposed to that particular intervention. So maybe there was like some sentencing guidelines that were implemented, and we take the people from the year prior who didn't fall within those sentencing guidelines, and the people who did, and so we compare those two groups. Or we can look at different locations. So let's say a program intervention was only done in certain parts of your city and not in others. And so you would link different neighborhoods that have similar demographics, but one was in the program intervention, one wasn't, and sort of see the differences between those things. Another way to do another form of quasi-experimental designs is the interrupted time series, which is when we have time as a part of our analysis. So time is in it, and we sort of have like a timeline of a trend, and then a policy intervention occurs, and then we see the change in the trend afterwards. But the issue with that is that it is definitely has issues with how reliability and instrumentation, history, and construct validity. And you can look into the quasi-experimental lecture for more on that. And sort of understanding the causal process is really important in interrupted time series, because you need to have an understanding of the causal forces behind it. So if it's like a specific policy intervention, that's great, because you could sort of define that, and you need to understand indicators used in it as well. And like oftentimes people do this through sort of showing the trends of the particular thing so they can understand the history behind it. And then sometimes people, so these, like the gold standard of evaluation is often experiments, but there is a form of scientific realism which realizes that treatment integrity, making sure that everyone has the same treatment, is sort of like unrealistic, and that instead if we look in if we get more rooted in the context in which we are in, then we can identify mechanisms and contexts to explain the dependent variables. And this is appropriate in small-scale evaluations towards a particular problem. So this is a sort of way to, the approach is different in that it's like, okay, let's really, really hone in this particular area, not try to make generalizations about whether or not this intervention works in other spaces, but instead focus on the context of our particular area and identify ways that we can change it at a small scale. And so when you're doing applied research, you're always going to be within like a political, ideological space of stakeholders and other people who have incentives for your particular evaluation to come out a specific way. And so you need to ensure that the different stakeholders are not producing different perspectives, and sort of sometimes it's good to get all those stakeholders in a conversation together and like really outline, okay, like what is the common ground, what are, maybe you think differently about this or that, but we need to like have some universal understanding between all of us. And before that, you need to identify who those particular stakeholders and community organizations are. And then it's really important to get buy-in into why evaluation is so important, because oftentimes it's sort of easier to take evaluation off the table and say we're just going to do this thing. But evaluation is really important for sort of protecting programs and their integrity and showing that they do work. And oftentimes people don't understand, like, why do I need to randomize things, or why do I need all these fancy jargon research methods? And you sort of sometimes need to educate people in layman's terms about why that's important and how you're sort of trying to isolate the program itself and take away the confounding variables. So a particular example of this is a social impact bond, which is a specific type of mechanism, which I'll show a diagram of it in a second. But jail contracts are like usually services. There is like a particular government organization. In this particular instance, I'm talking about jail contracts where a government, a prison, the state government will put out a request for proposal. So they'll say, like, this is the particular service we want. It could be anything from like providing food for people in the particular jails, or it could be like providing program and counseling in jails, or for people in house arrest, or for people on parole or probation, whatnot. So government organizations will put out requests for proposals. Even foundations sometimes put out requests for proposals of a particular service that they want. And usually there's a defined outcome that they would like to have met, or sort of like standards or particular things they want incorporated into the service that you're providing. So if you're a nonprofit organization or a government organization, you might be writing the request for proposal. or you could be applying to it. So service providers often apply to these requests. They're posted on different government websites, and you apply with your sort of nonprofit business identification, and you submit a proposal, and then if it's approved, the provider and the government or foundation organization will be in a particular contract with particular outcomes that are supposed to be met, and the fees and payment that the government will provide for those services. So it could be like a 3-year contract or a 10-year contract, and once that's up, you might be up for renewal, or you might have to reapply. And so there's a particular type of this process that's had a little bit of popularity and then waned a bit, which is social impact bonds, because a lot of government organizations have issues with money, and like New Jersey is in a lot of debt and has a lot of issues because there's a large pension that they have to pay across the state. And so Illinois, also where I'm from, has a lot of debt too. So some people have tried to get around this by involving private investors. So private investors in a social impact bond will provide money to a social service provider and an independent evaluator. And if the independent evaluator finds that the program was successful, then the government will pay the investor. And if the independent evaluator finds that the program was unsuccessful, then the private investor loses their money and doesn't get the money back. So they're putting up the money prior, and the government is waiting to see whether or not the program was successful and whether or not they're going to pay them back. So this is a different type of financing that could be interesting to see in particular contexts, because it allows the government to only pay for successful programs. And so I actually worked at Rikers Island in a particular social impact bond. And so this was sort of how it was set up. Goldman Sachs and Bloomberg Philanthropies provided money to MDRC, which was an intermediary, and they provided money to the social programs, the Osborne Associations and Friends of Island Academy, and they provided money for them to deliver an intervention to 16 to 18-year-olds at Rikers. And Vera did an independent evaluation. So if Vera found the program was successful, then Goldman and Bloomberg would get their money back. But if it found that it was unsuccessful, then they would get a loss for the program and they would lose those funds. And their particular goals right here were that if recidivism was reduced by a particular amount. So the particular intervention was based off of moral recognition therapy, which is sort of a workbook of counseling, and the benefits were that like social work certification was not needed. The workbook made sure that like there were particular steps in the program, and that's how the treatment integrity was measured. So there's different levels of treatment that people received. So if a person got up to step 10, then they had a particular threshold of intervention, versus if a person got up to step 2 or 3. So the workbook sort of followed people in and out of jail, which is nice because there's a lot of turnover and recidivism that occurs. So they were allowed to do the workbook in prison settings and out of it. But it is also a difficult population because there are sort of going in and out and in and out of particular jails. And the whole point was to sort of reduce it through counseling, through programming, and it's a sort of type of therapy. At the time that this was happening, there was a lot of contraband sweeps, and there was also an investigation into violence towards teens at Rikers. The federal government issued this, and the United States Attorney released a 79 report about like human rights violations that were occurring to these young, to the youth, and civil rights violation of male teenagers at Rikers Island. So that makes the policy intervention very difficult because there are other extraneous factors that are really impacting people's mental health during the intervention. And this is a map of Rikers Island, so it's right here, like literally on an island. You need to like take an MTA bus to get there. And that's the only way to access it if you're in the public. And so, let's see where. Right here are where sort of the program was implemented. And so the study, the independent study, the outcome that was supposed to happen was supposed to be a 10% reduction in recidivism. And so 87% of the people who were involved in the program completed at least one session, but only 44% reached a programmatic milestone, and there was no 10% reduction in recidivism. And the way that they made it an experiment, because people weren't randomly assigned when they were going through the program, the case flow was that they just got into the program as soon as they were of a certain age and entered the jail. So those people who didn't get the program and those who did were matched on criminal charge, age, race, and gender using propensity score matching, which is like a fancy statistical way of making sure that the sort of the control people who received the program and those who didn't are the same. So you can compare those results to understand if the intervention actually reduced recidivism, which the Vera Institute found that it did not. So that's an example of a particular program evaluation within a particular context, and you see that within the social impact bond, there are a lot of different players that have to all come together and define what the particular intervention was. And I think being on the ground in this particular intervention, there were a lot of issues with like correctional officers being able to bring people to do the counseling, and then also like variability in the counseling itself, because you don't necessarily need a social work background to do it, and it's a workbook, so it could be implemented and taught in very different ways across the space. And given the fact that there are other extraneous things that could influence whether or not a person goes back to jail, like this is just a counseling thing, it's not affecting the economic situation of people coming out of jail, it's not affecting their housing, it's like just counseling. And so given that context, the intervention did not produce an outcome that reduced recidivism in this context. And I think that there are like, definitely counseling is important, but there are tangible, overwhelming factors of economic instability, housing instability, that people just like in order to sort of get out of a criminal contact, you really, like, it's difficult to do that if you're, like, more on the street because your housing is so unstable and you're trying to get more economic means to sustain yourself, right? And then, I mean, this traumatic violence is also a variable that was not accounted for, that, like, really it's hard to receive counseling when you're in a very violent space, that your civil rights are constantly being undermined. So in this context, I think the policy intervention was too small to sort of surmount all of the challenges and difficulties that these 16 to 18-year-old men had to deal with. And I think that this was an intervention prior and, like, sort of in the beginnings of a movement to close Rikers down because of all of the violations of civil rights that were occurring and violence that had been occurring. So I think that you can see that sometimes program evaluations are trying to be implemented at the same time in which there's sort of activism going on to do more radical interventions as well. And you can look up, like, the Close Rikers campaign. A lot of it is done because and spurred by the fact that, like, people have died in solitary confinement, like Kalief Browder, and, like, have been held in jail for very, very small misdemeanor crimes that and the sort of processing of trials and plea bargaining makes it so that people just sort of want to serve their time instead of fighting their cases, and it's a very difficult cycle. And remember that when people are in jails, like, this is all at Rikers jails, they haven't been convicted of anything yet, or they're serving their time for something that happened that's usually under a year that they received a conviction for. So it's a very difficult space to be in if you still haven't been convicted of something, and it often creates incentives for people to plea even if they haven't committed the crime because they just want to serve their time and get out. And so another evaluation that is an example I'm providing is there's bail reform, which is occurring across the US, and this is actually on the podcast website that I had you guys do for your memo for experimental and quasi-experimental lecture, and it's by Megan Stevenson, so if you want to go on that particular podcast and hear this particular intervention, you can. And this is sort of a summary of that, and we've had a long history of bail reform. Like, bail reform was attempted in the 60s and in the 80s, and now we're in a current wave. And so prior to the 60s, there were no alternative to bail, and bail was sort of created in the 1890s. It's sort of a remnant of European courts that we adopted within our states, and it comes from that legacy, and the whole point of it is to ensure appearance at trial. And during the 60s, in part motivated by Vera Institute, there was a push to create other conditions and supervision. So, like, supervision, or like having someone, like a relative or someone, ensure that you are going to go to your trial. And so there were exceptions for capital cases, and the judge was allowed to sort of take into account dangerousness for capital cases rather than just whether or not you were able to appear at trial and if you were a flight risk. And so that dangerousness was actually expanded to all cases in the federal 1984 Act. And so now judges can take into account dangerousness to the community and whether or not you're a flight risk and will appear at trial. And so now in this current wave, there's a lot of emphasis on risk assessments and your likelihood of committing crime while you're out. And so there's this like preventative aspect that's incorporated, even though people haven't been convicted yet and are just like being detained prior to their trial, so they're not leaving. And a lot of people can't post bail. It's disproportionately affects people who don't have a lot of income and can't be posting large amounts of bail, whereas wealthy people can post bail and like don't necessarily need to be stuck in jail prior to their trial. And so Megan Stevenson had a good quote that pretrial detention contributes to the number of people incarcerated. It constitutes 1 in 5% of the entire incarcerated population. That includes prisons as well. And that's more people serving time for drug sentences. So it does contribute a lot to people who are currently incarcerated. They have like shorter stints in jail, but they are incarcerated prior to ever being convicted. And so there's preventative detention versus excessive bail, and we have a constitutional right against excessive bail, but the Supreme Court hasn't really defined what excessive bail is. And so is that relative to what the average bail is that people usually get? Is that excessive to your particular instance because of your particular economic status? What I think is excessive bail might be different than someone who makes like $500,000 a year, right? And so you can, in a lot of spaces, depending on the state's constitutional rights, judges can institute or not institute preventative detention. And so that means that you're detained regardless, not based off of whether or not you commit bail, but if you're seen as a danger to the community. And states that don't allow judges to do preventative detention, judges can get around that by sort of instituting large amounts of bail that realistically people can't pay. So they end up going to jail because it's not feasible for them to pay it. But defining excessive bail, like I said, is difficult. And so prior literature has shown that if there's bail, you're often going to be detained because people have a hard time even posting like $500 for bail. It's just like a lot of people are living paycheck to paycheck and like reasonably can't pay even what the court defines as nominal, like lower amounts of bail. And there are a lot of downstream consequences for if you are detained prior to your conviction. So you're more likely to plea because maybe you just want to get out of jail and you're like, I don't care about this minor charge. I just put it on my record, but I need to get back out and like provide for my family and work. People who are also detained are often usually receive longer sentencing. And there is a criminogenic aspect of bail of detention in jail, where if you've been detained in jail, then you're more likely to be rearrested for something later. And it has a lot of destabilizing effects on economic outcomes. So if you're detained, you might lose your job. You might have more difficulty having a job later because you were detained. And it has a lot of downstream consequences for people economically. But all of that literature is not accounting for the selection that occurs in people who are rearrested and detained and whatnot. So there could be a higher propensity of committing crime for people who are detained pre-trial. So all of the sort of criminogenic link between being detained and receiving bail and getting arrested and all of those different steps in the process have selection biases. So are you in a neighborhood that is disproportionately policed? Are you then more likely to be arrested because you are actually committing a crime? And so there's all of these sort of links that select people into this space. And what's important about causal inference is it isolates, okay, just receiving bail. If you just receive bail, does that negatively affect things? Controlling for your charge, controlling for your racial demographics, controlling for the neighborhood that you come from. And so the causal method that people have done is random assignment to judges. So let's try to control for all the things prior to that. If you're randomly assigned to a judge, regardless of whether or not you actually committed the crime, there are some judges that are more likely to institute higher amounts of bail, and there are some judges that are going to institute lower amounts. So if we randomly assign you, and often people are randomly assigned to judges, let's see how let's make that the randomization, so that way the people who receive high amounts of bail and the people who don't look equivalent, and we can identify what the cause of bail actually is. And so in this particular intervention, it was evaluating a reform done by a district attorney. So in the bail context, there are a lot of interventions. Like in New Jersey, it was implemented by the Chief Justice and the courts, and then adopted by the legislators. So it's a statewide reform, whereas in this particular reform and evaluation, it's in Philadelphia by the district attorney Krasner, who is sort of a progressive attorney, and completely eliminated bail for most nonviolent crimes. So it was just one swooping action by one person, versus in New Jersey, it was a whole legislative process and a buildup, and it applied to most everyone, and completely revamped the entire court system across the state. So there's so many more stakeholders at play, so much more room for policy implementation on the books versus in reality. And whereas this reform is very isolated, smaller space, where one person did this elimination and it's sort of across the board for nonviolent crimes. And that's a difficulty too, is that a lot of policy interventions only apply to nonviolent crimes. So we can't really see what the effects are for violent crimes, and there's some irony in that violent crimes often have less recidivism. So it makes things a little bit more complicated. So this particular reform made it so prosecutors can no longer ask for cash bail if defendants are charged with 25 nonviolent offenses, and there's a list of them that they can't ask for bail. So this is on the prosecutor's side. And so this applies to 2/3 of all cases that go through the Philly court system, and it doesn't change judges' decisions. So they were trying to analyze whether or not this reform actually had an effect because of the cutouts, because it only applied to prosecutors. And they found that, yes, the reform did have a significant impact. It led to a 22% increase in the likelihood that defendants would be given ROR, which is release on recognizance. So people are just released and expected to come to their court date when it's done later. And so this is sort of a difference in difference design. And so sort of like a time series analysis, so you see these trends prior, and the line here is the intervention that occurs. So we want to see if this trend, this difference between here and here is significant. And we see here that there was a massive jump in ROR, so there was a significant difference. And we see from here to here that there was not a large difference between jail time, and from here to here that there wasn't a huge jump in recidivism or failure to appear. And so they measured those things because those are often the arguments against bail reform, is that there's going to be increased recidivism because those people should have been in jail, they're going to come back to jail, or they're going to fail to appear, and therefore they're like someone who may have committed a crime is just out there and we can't track them down. And so this is the exogenous shock. The intervention is the implementation of this reform. And so they found that there was a 5% decline in the number of people that needed to spend a night in jail, but there was no effect on jail stays long term, and no statistically significant increase in FTA recidivism. And the way that they created a control group, because this is a quasi-experimental design, it's not experimental. People are not randomly assigned to bail, but they are randomly assigned to judge, and the leniency of the judge is sort of how they create a control group and a not control group. And so this is context specific. It has issues with generalization because it's in one city, it's not statewide. Philly does all of their bail in-house, so there's no bail bondsman industry, which is a huge, large economic industry that has been advocating against bail reform. So that limits generalizability. And a lot of people need to recognize that like a shift in bail reform is just changing the amount of jail time that people serve from the front end to the back end, because a lot of times when people do get their conviction, a lot of times they'll be their sentence will be time served. So if they've already served 5 or 6 months in jails and it's a small crime, then they're done, they can get out, versus if we allow people to show up to their court date later and they are convicted, then they'll just be serving that time on the back end rather than on the front end. And that is important because if they're not convicted, then a lot of people had served jail time, and the time that they served in jail, if they're not convicted, is just time that they had to serve, and they don't receive any reparations for that time. I believe in Texas they do provide some. Okay, so now we're gonna shift. We have talked about, I gave you sort of a buildup of how to do program evaluation and how to define the stakeholders and the policy intervention and some examples. And now we're gonna get into how to analyze secondary data and do content analysis. And how to use, do some secondary analysis as well. So oftentimes in criminal justice, we're depending on data that comes from agencies. within the criminal justice system. So the data we're getting wasn't intended for evaluation, it was intended for internal use within the criminal justice department. So we sort of need to be wary of that. Like we talked about in crime rates, a lot of our crime rates are dependent on police departments and not necessarily some independent measure that a researcher is developing themselves. It's dependent on the state and therefore has its own biases within it because it isn't necessarily used to develop a crime rate that's independent of the state. It's a crime rate that's defined by the state, right? And therefore we get this dark figure of crime that the state might not always see all of the crimes that occur, so the crime rate we do have is somewhat biased. And so when we're doing secondary analysis, we're often dealing with those issues. And we're also going to talk about content analysis. So it's when we are analyzing communication of different forms, and that we'll get to later in the lecture. So there are different types of agency records, and whoa. Let's go back here. Okay. And so there are some topics that are more appropriate for research than others. So usually the published statistics that we get from agencies are used in descriptive or exploratory studies rather than causal studies because there are issues with selection in it. And sometimes we combine different data sets from those spaces to do our analysis. And it might be used as supplemental sources as well. And so you really need to understand how the written records are produced and what those specific biases are in order to understand whether or not it's appropriate for your particular analysis. And sometimes you'll need to triangulate the data, which means to find other data sources that tell you whether or not the data that you have is reliable. So there's different types of agency records. There's published statistics, non-public agency records, and new data collected by agency staff, like if you're trying to work collaboratively with a criminal justice agency. And so examples of published statistics would be the census, FBI data, Federal Bureau of Prisons, the annual survey of jails. Vera Institute just implemented like a cool data query where you can, it's called In Your Backyard, where you can see in your specific geographic location, like the amount of people detained in jail in your area. And these are often available in libraries and online. There's ICPSR, which has a whole bunch of data sets for people to look at. I'll also post that in the supplementary resource as well. And then non-public agency records, an example of them would be if you're, like I'm working with a parole board agency and I'm looking at going to parole hearings and collecting my own data, so that would be more a new data collected, I'm collecting it myself. Or if the parole agency provides me with data that they don't put on their website, like on individual statistics of who gets paroled and their different demographics and their criminal histories, those aren't available online. The parole rate is, but not the sort of background statistics of what composes that parole rate. So if I get that individual level statistics that makes up that aggregate that's non-public agency records that I'm getting and working with a department. And there are particular things that go in place to ensure anonymity. I'm getting those records, but I'm not getting people's names or any of those like identifying information to ensure anonymity. And a lot of secondary data that you get from agencies, if it's anonymized, then there's not necessarily the people who are the data is talking about don't necessarily need to consent. So it's sort of beneficial, but we'll get into how that can be an issue when we're talking about big data as well. And so there's also like decision making, like I can get, like if you're working with a particular agency and like a parole board, like how the parole board voted, that would be a measure of different decision making practices as well. A new data collected, this could be, you can have more control over it. So like if I do court observations and I'm collecting data myself, that's a new data collection method. Or if you're working with a particular agency and you're getting like counselors to collect data or parole officers and to institute data collection measures in their space, you'd have to sort of train them in doing that, and it would need to be sort of a larger effort. And so you have less control of the reliability of the data if you aren't doing it yourself or training other researchers to do it, but if you're working with more service providers. But if you train them well, you can ensure reliability. It's just a challenge of cooperation and training. And so you need to be aware of sort of matches or mismatches with units of analysis. Like we talked about, it's possible to move from individual to aggregate units. So I can move to individual arrests to like neighborhood crime rates, but I can't move from neighborhood crime rates to individual arrests. Often, sometimes you can, like I talked about, like I can get the parole rate for a particular jail or institution, and then maybe get the aggregate of how that parole rate was created. If you have and are collaborating with that institution, but if you're getting it from an online source that's publicly available, you're not able to do that. Okay. And here are some units of analysis in the criminal justice analysis. So there might be incidents of criminal activity, victims, offenders, court activity. There are defendants, filings, charges, and all of these unit analysis could be in the same data source. So you really need to think through your unit of analysis and how you can analyze your unit of analysis to your particular findings. And so all secondary data sources that are dependent on the criminal justice system are a social process in themselves. So if we're getting data from police, that's going to be reflective of police deployment, and we need to take that into account. And there's a lot of discretion that it could occur and different factors in record keeping, like there might be missing data. And like if you're getting more public data, a lot of that comes from surveys. So the Bureau of the Census of Prisons or the annual survey of jails, that's coming from administrators filling out a survey. So there might be issues with reliability because it's sort of an aggregate of something in a particular snapshot rather than you getting all of their data at one time from all of those organizations. And there's different purposes of agency record keeping versus us as researchers. So CJ organizations are often trying to keep track of individuals rather than examine particular patterns. So they might only collect data on individuals and not necessarily other larger, higher units of analysis as well. And there is definitely issues with clerical errors as well. And there could be changes in data collection procedures. Like, so maybe you had to collect data on a particular variable in one instance and then they stopped in another instance, or the definitions of different variables change over time. And that can also be issues that you really need to be aware of. So oftentimes when there are public agency data, it'll come with a code book for each year. And so it's really important to read the code books and see if there's any major distinctions from year to year within the code books. Ooh. Okay. So that's talking about secondary data, and you can apply the statistical analysis usually to these secondary data that we talked about in interpreting data in prior lectures. Now there's content analysis, which a lot of you were interested in. So that's the systematic study of messages and forms of communication. And this can include a lot of different artifacts like books, magazines, films, songs, speeches. Like sometimes there will be like zines or little newsletters that people who are incarcerated can submit to. So it could be like their writings. It could be a lot of social media now is content. So like any discussion board posts or Twitter conversations, like all of that. The wide range in which you can analyze content is very large. And so it's helpful for answering questions of like who said what to whom, why, how, more like discourse questions. And it requires like careful understanding of what. So you really need to think about like what you're looking at, and sort of it's, I think, harder to make generalizations, and you need to think about sampling in the particular space that you're looking and how you're getting this particular information. So it could be more archival and historical narratives that you're looking at, which might have particular issues, or it could be more social media platforms, more modern forms of content analysis that you're looking at as well. So you really need to think about how this reflects on your larger question and analyze your collected data. And there's a wide spectrum of ways in which you can do content analysis, like I said, from the more historical to the more modern. So you could look at newspapers and like how people talk about particular people, or how people talk about crime, or you could look at like social media and how people talk or vent about crime in their interpersonal things. And there's issues with reliability and sampling in both of those, because people use different types of social media platforms, and we'll get into that in a second. And so content analysis is sort of like qualitative analysis in that you're taking like, whereas in qualitative analysis, you're taking a structured interview or you're taking field notes and coding for it. In content analysis, you're taking specific artifacts like newspapers or books or whatnot and coding for it. So you need to first establish your universe, like I talked about, like what are you in a particular platform? Are you in a particular like historical time frame and geographic location? Are you looking at like newspapers in the South during the 1900s? You need to understand your sampling frame and then understand your sample. And so you can randomize yourself in what you pick to analyze to allow you to define error and to have more generalizability within that space. And you need to code according to a conceptual framework. So oftentimes people will define, and I'll get into the examples with big data and how they do this, different metrics and for how they're analyzing a particular thing, especially if they're moving content analysis into quantitative analysis. But it could be more qualitative, and you could just read through a lot of things on your own and handwrite the codes as well, and like do more of an inductive thing where the data that you have creates the questions that you develop in the theory. And that sort of gets to the how you're analyzing these theoretical concerns and observations. So it might be more in manifest content, like the visible, the surface content, what jumps up at you, what are the similarities, or it could be more latent underlying meaning. So really doing a deep read of particular things and trying to interpret how people say things. So this, like a lot of like literature analysis would be helpful in this coding scheme. It's sort of similar. And you want to make sure, if you're doing more quantitative analysis, you're defining variables as mutually exclusive and exhaustive. And if you're doing this on your own, it might be a little bit more hard with validity. So you want to maybe code with multiple people to make sure that you're getting the same results, and using, like if you're developing a coding scheme, which we'll get into more, like different types of coding schemes, then you want to make sure that it's applied universally and is a good coding scheme. So you might develop a coding scheme, test it with a smaller sample and with different coders and see how your reliability is, and then maybe adjust it afterwards. So your book has an example of newspaper stories and crimes. So Shermack sampled crime stories every fifth day, so that's systematic sampling, remember, in the first 6 months of 1990. And so they developed a lot of different samples, and they tried to see how content determines allotment of space and prominence of place. So this is how they define their variables. So space and prominence were defined by the inches of coverage in the paper, where stories were placed, size of headlines. So you can see, like, they're not looking at the particular descriptive, so it's not the latent content, the underlying meaning. Instead, they're talking about the visible surface content, the manifest content. So they're talking about like how the coverage was placed and the size of the headlines, which are more surface things, and also coding for types of crimes, weapon usage, location. So how this interrelates with these, and these are more surface things. It's not like he's reading through it and really trying to understand the description and deep, in-depth dive of how people describe things. Instead, more how things appear and more of a, like we said, manifest content rather than latent content. It's not looking at the underlying meaning. And like I said, sometimes researchers make their data available to people after. Like there's different studies, like there's the Chicago Health Study or the National Health Study, and so researchers will collect data and then make their data available for secondary analysis. And sometimes you combine different data sources to analyze or expand on what the researchers did in their research. So it may be advantageous to see if there's already data on a particular question out there that has been collected by another researcher. It's cost effective to do that, but you do need to recognize how your question is different than their question and what different biases might occur because of that. And the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research is a really good resource for that, and I'll post a link to that in this final week's content folder. So a lot of you are interested in big data, so I'm just going to briefly go over a couple examples and like what is big data. And obviously I'm not an expert on this. This is just sort of a primer for you all. And so within the last 3 to 5 years, there's been more data recorded than the rest of human history combined. And that's because we're always engaging with computers, our phones, our laptops, Alexa and Siri, and like your purchasing is all online. So all of our behavior is being coded in these ways through computers because we've become so much more digital. Like our communication is digital, and it's like not only like text information and data, but it's also digital content and video, and it's in so many different fields that we've developed this large amount of data. And big data is often distinguished by its volume, velocity, and variety. And so what that means is that the volume is how much data there is, and that there is such a large amount of data, and because of that there's often issues with having to store it, and so people rely on the cloud and other digital forms of storing that data. The velocity of data is oftentimes in the amount of time that the data is collected. So for example, body cameras, the velocity of that data is collected very, very, very quickly. And there's high uplink speeds and high amounts of being able to post that data. Even in me doing this lecture, I can post that data very quickly, and that's because we've developed these supercomputers that can easily track and post this data and upload at large amounts of speed. Whereas prior in the 90s, we would have to wait hours upon hours for the computer to interpret and post this data. And then, I sort of got into, the variety of the data is also a distinguishment of big data. So it's web camera, the sort of visual data that we're collecting. There's also surveillance systems, cameras, license plate readers. This is all from sort of police perspective, but also in more sciences, there's a lot of drones taking pictures of landscapes and Google Maps you think of, and so those are photos and videos. And then there's also other forms of text data, tweets and whatnot. So the variety of data is also very, very large as well. And actually 16% of police departments are using cloud computing, so it's really big in surveillance and policing. In more high tech, urban areas, definitely. And you can also integrate large data sets from multiple sources as well. And this is all because of our constant interaction with computers. So this presents a lot of opportunities for researchers, and then a lot of pitfalls too. So oftentimes people think more data just means that we're going to be better at research, but that's not necessarily true. And like I said, because of the variety which was one of the 3 V's of the data, there's so many different ways that you can analyze the data. So you can do qualitative analysis, you can do textual and content analysis like we talked about, you can do spatial mapping, data visualization. But a lot of the issue in getting this data is that there was sort of, especially in the US, a shift from academic and government institutions collecting data. We were often the source of big data to private organizations like the big 3, like Google, Facebook, Apple. And so that data is monetized then, and like it's not universally accessible. And there's often issues with like universities and governments have like IRB, parameters by which we collect data and anonymize things, whereas private companies have more reign to do what they would like with that data. And there's less transparency on it as well. And so a lot of analysis, or people who are academics that work on big data, are often working interdisciplinary wise, and usually there's always sort of a computer scientist in that realm because they have more of an understanding of how computers collect that data and how to do that. And then there's also a lot of academics who will do data scraping work, so collecting data from the internet through particular programming tools, and data engineers and computer scientists usually do that work. So here are a couple examples of some data, big data analysis. So this is a paper called Language from Police Body Camera Footage, shows racial disparities in officer respect by Voigt and et al., which is a bunch of authors on this particular article. And you'll see that a lot of big data analysis has a lot of different authors because there are a bunch of people from different disciplines trying to analyze this larger data. So they used footage from body-worn cameras in Oakland, California, and this is sort of like content analysis. So they developed this scheme of a respect score for how police officers' language towards white and Black community members differed during routine traffic stops. So they developed a computational linguistic methods schema. And so you have linguists that are working on this project, and computer scientists, and then also criminal justice scholars. And so they sort of provided this programming scheme, and you can see here how they defined it. So obviously it's anonymized, and so they created this program to identify within the transcript what are different indicators of respect or disrespect. So you see here that questions, suspended is a negative word, that is disfluency, so this is a disconnected question. Can I see that driver's license again? It's showing suspended, that's you. And so there's some skepticism in the voice by having some discontinuity, right? All right, my man. So there's an informal title, ask for agency adverbial. Do me a favor, just keep your hands on the steering wheel real quick. And so there's these different linguistic indicators that they've identified with a respect score. Sorry to stop you, my name's blank with the police department. So there's more formality here. For sure, there's apology, introduction, and they called themselves by their last name, so it's more formalized. And so they developed this whole schema prior, and then they applied it to the data that they had. And so they had participants rating officers' utterances. So this is a survey aspect of it. So sort of mixed methods in grading survey research, and pre-testing the schema to define a schema in which they applied to the larger analysis of these body-worn cameras. So they randomly sampled 414 unique officer utterances. That's 1.1% of all usable utterances. So that's a lot of data that they're working with, and the way that they get to sample it allows for generalizability. But just think about the fact that 414 is 1% is a lot of data. And so you see that they use stratified disproportionate sampling because they sampled 312 Black community members and 102 white community members. And so the regular population of Oakland is 23% white and 36%. So you see that they're interested in racial disparities. So when we're interested in racial disparities, we often use stratified disproportionate sampling because we can over sample the vulnerable populations or minority populations that we are sampling from in order to talk about racial disparities. We're not talking about generalizations of how police officers talk. We're wanting to divide and see if there's racial inequalities within it. So we're doing disproportionate sampling because of that. So here is a really cool graph of their respect model coefficients. So they talk. They identify these sort of indicators, and along disrespectful or more respectful, this is the respect model that they developed. And this is the log odds ratio by race. So you can see Black stops versus white stops. And these are more negative versus these are more positive respect models. And you see how the Black stops disproportionately have more informal titles, more linguistic negation, more questions, because of the little asterisks are significance. And then white stops, you see that they are more concerned with safety, often incorporate more formal titles and reassurances. So you can visually see that this is a really good visual representation of statistics. They could have done this in just numbers, but I think the graph really shows how these differences occur. So they found that officers speak with consistently less respect towards Black versus white community members, even after controlling for the race of the officer, the severity of the infraction, the location of the stop, and the outcome of the stop. And such disparities in common everyday interactions between police and communities have important implications for procedural justice and the building of police community trust. And I think this is a really interesting study because it's using big data, but it's taking a smaller sample so it can make generalizations. But something they didn't take into account is the deployment of officers and their different educational backgrounds, which could have an influence as well. But I think it's a really interesting study that uses big data in a way that is able to be generalizable and is able to get at these small interactions that we would normally not get at, right? Without the use of body-worn cameras. But that's not the intended use of body-worn cameras. Is more was more spurred through a lot of police-involved shootings and whatnot, not necessarily the interactions and micro-interactions and mundane interactions of police and community members. So this is an example of using secondary data that this is not what it was intended to be used for is like respect towards communities and like everyday interactions. But it is a way that we can use that data. And I think it's applied in a very interesting way and is definitely important research. Another example is not necessarily a criminal justice example, but I am interested in immigration. So, do anti-immigrant laws shape public sentiment? A study by Arizona Senate Bill 1070 using Twitter data by Renee D. Flores. I'm not related. We just have the same last name. So this looked at tweets after this passage of this bill and was a way to sort of understand public attitudes and behaviors towards immigrants. So they did a sentiment analysis and a difference in difference. So it's combining content analysis with quasi-experimental designs because it's difference in difference. So the Senate bill is the intervention. It's like the like we saw in the previous difference in difference. It's like a trend, and then there's this policy intervention, and we analyze the difference before and after that intervention occurred in time. And so they found that the bill had a negative impact on the average sentiments of tweets regarding immigrants, Mexicans, and Hispanics, but not on those about Asians or Blacks. So they can look at the different demographics and how they're perceived. So obviously this bill, even though it applies to all immigrants, has connotations towards Latin American immigrants in particular. And what they found, which was interesting, which you can find in content analysis, which they're doing, is dynamics and mechanisms, right? And so they found, so this causal approach of the difference in difference can say, yes, there was a negative impact. I saw that. But the content analysis is what allows them to see that the shifting attitudes weren't because of shifting attitudes towards immigrants, but because anti-immigrant users were more mobilized and motivated by new users to begin tweeting anti-immigrant rhetoric. And so they're saying, while some scholars propose that punitive laws can shape people's attitudes towards targeted groups, this study shows that policies are more likely to influence behaviors. And so anti-immigrant laws, they argue, may stir the pot further, mobilizing individuals already critical of immigrants to be more vocal, rather than placating the electorate. So this is an interesting article. I think one critique that definitely is here that is also in sort of issues with generalizability and big data too is there's a lot of bots on Twitter, and whether or not those anti-immigrant users were bots or real people is an issue. Because, and this is a good segue into our issues with generalizability and big data, is we often think that just because we have more data, it's more statistically significant, but that's not true. If you've learned anything through this research methods, you know that we need to have a sample frame and then randomly select from that sample frame. Everyone's has the same amount of probability of being chosen into that sample frame in order for us to be able to quantify our error. But if we don't have a sampling frame, then we can't quantify our error and we can't make generalizations about our larger sampling frame, right? We learned that in sampling the first 2 weeks of this class. So the issue is that with big data, we don't have a systematic sampling frame. So for example, there's like a bunch of databases that try to identify different news events, but those news events are susceptible to biases in who covers the news in those areas and whether or not there are news institutions in those areas, right? So because of that, coverage might be geographically and temporally uneven. We know that in more urban areas, there are more likely to be news institutions, whereas maybe in more rural areas, they don't have those institutions there. So therefore, there's just like some bias in that coverage. And so those long-standing issues don't disappear. And so big data isn't the solution to everything, because we still have those biases in whatever topic you're looking at. You're still going to have those biases, and more data doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to disappear. Instead, you need more sampling still applies, right? So we still have issues with selection, missing data, and thin coverage. And we don't know the amount of people under or over-reported. So a good example of big data is like, okay, so we have the census. Big data is like, currently the census is people, there's a certain amount of people that go door to door. That's how traditionally the census was done. Big data would be like if we had hundreds of people go door to door to collect data on people. There's like a bunch more collection points, but those collection points aren't necessarily getting to the systematic issues of sampling, of are we disproportionately sampling the people who don't necessarily have homes, who we might not engage with during the day because they work during the night. Those particular issues are still going to be there, and we don't know how many, just because we have more people, we might have overrepresentation of the same people. We're not systematically sampling, right? So sampling is really key to understanding big data. And especially in this new wave of social media, and like Twitter often is seen as the space for a lot of researchers to understand content analysis. But obviously different platforms have differences in the sampling that they do, and who's more likely to be on Snapchat versus Instagram, which is very different versus Facebook. Like Facebook is a longer held platform, so there might be people of more varying ages on that, versus Snapchat, which is newer and is definitely more visual, and I think I would argue applies more to younger folks. So there are these divisions in platforms and who goes into those spaces, which creates different demographic profiles within those platforms. You can't necessarily generalize about communication or whatever you're studying in those particular platforms to the general population. You can only do it within that sampling frame. And so then that leads to an overstatement of findings and underestimation of error. And like I talked about in the previous study, we have issues with bots and organizations that can create rigged systems. Sometimes bots are trying to, like, there's this assumption that there's a user behind each platform that is authentic, that is not trying to manipulate the space of the platform, but is just communicating, and that's not always true, right? And then there are larger issues with research ethics. So there's no consensus on what the rules should be for how we use this big data. It's high risk because there are issues with re-identification. I think there's that Ashley whatever website that like just published a bunch of people who were involved in infidelity and looking for other partners online. Like that not only affects the people who were looking on those websites, but the people connected to those people as well. And so there's a different meaning and management of consent. When people are constantly collecting data on us, we don't necessarily have consent for, one, that data to be collected, or two, how that data is used. And so oftentimes the way that IRB and academic institutions looks at it is, if there's a third party that's collecting the data and it's anonymized, then consent isn't necessarily required. But that was prior to the big data age, so we'll see how that occurs. And there's also rights of secondary subjects too. So like I mentioned before, maybe you're talking about a particular friend online, but they didn't consent to you talking about them, right? And so the university can play a larger role here. It isn't necessarily, but I think there are cool things coming out in that. And there is this book, Give Methods a Chance. They sort of talk about big data as well, and I'll post additional resources on that. And then Sarah Lageson, who's also in our department, just published a book about criminal records and the private industry around posting mugshots online and criminal records online, and therefore people just have their criminal records, regardless if they get them expunged later in life, just there forever. And people can pay money to get that information lower down in the search because of how Google works. But for people who can't, like whenever they apply to a job, if someone Googles their name, their criminal record is always there. And mugshots are just when you're in booking, right? Not after you've been convicted. So there are a bunch of issues with that. So I'll post that book as well. But this was like a very quick lecture. You're not going to be tested on any of this. I just thought that this would be additional resources for you all. And thank you.